Good morning, everybody, and thank you so much for the opportunity to join you and be part of this conference. And I had prepared a completely different start to this presentation, but after the last talk, I felt myself kind of choking up a bit, so I've changed a little bit of what I was going to say. So let me just say firstly that it's a great honour to be here, and I've found the whole experience and the welcome I've had incredibly generous, and I'm really happy to be part of this, and I kind of hope you're happy that I'm here as well, because you get quite a lot of me. So this is part one, and you get part two tomorrow morning, and anybody who's got a particular taste for suffering and misery also has the opportunity to come on Saturday morning and spend the whole of that morning in a workshop with me. So yeah, with no further ado, I'm going to start by basically saying I think I'm going to present some evidence around some of the things we know about recovery. But I want to do it in the context of something that I think is crucially important, which is recovery has been presented as a kind of hope-based model for change. And it is that, but I'm going to argue that recovery and how it's done by professionals and by communities is fundamentally a marker or a measure of the quality of that community, and that how inclusive and how reintegrative societies are around addiction recovery and other excluded and marginalised populations effectively is an indicator of the connectedness, the hope and the well-being of the community as a whole. And I was so pleased to hear some of those introductory comments about well-being and connectedness, because they are absolutely at the heart of all of the positive things the recovery movement potentially represents. I work in something called the Helena Kennedy Centre for International Justice, and the primary purpose of this centre is twofold. It's about human rights and it's about social justice. And for me, the fundamental premise of recovery is as an issue of social justice. And really, at the heart of what I'm going to say each day is that the recovery process is individually driven, but collectively determined. The person has to drive their own recovery journey, but the success of that journey is a series of concentric circles that involves their networks, their communities, and the wider communities and structures of society will ultimately determine whether their own efforts will be fruitful or successful or not. And that seems to me just critical to how we have to make sense of the pathway to recovery. Now, I'm going to start with some fairly dull research statistics, and I'm going to do it to illustrate some of the things that we know about recovery models. Oh, right, yes. So, I guess one of the starkest research findings is the average duration of an addiction's career from first use of an active substance to stable recovery, on average, takes around 27 years. So, to reinforce the points just made earlier by Mr. Ledger, I guess one of the key things to say is there are myriad and multiple windows of early intervention and opportunities for change. It also challenges all of these notions that harm reduction and recovery are somehow fundamentally incompatible. Because there's a big secret about recovery. It's harder to recover if you're dead. And so there are plenty of early windows of opportunity for harm reduction, substitute prescribing, a whole range of things. Now, what do we know? We know that the average data, and it's an average, it would be great if it was a rule, but it's an average, and people vary massively from the average, that people's first use of a psychoactive substance typically occurs somewhere between 10 and 13. There's then a huge window of opportunity for change, that basically, before people experience substance dependence, will typically not happen till they're around 20 or 21. So there's a big window there for prevention and early intervention opportunities. And that's where this slide starts, is addiction onset typically starts around 20. But the people will typically have at least 4 to 5 years of unsuccessful self-stopping attempts and help-seeking attempts before they effectively engage. And then, on average, people have around an 8-year window in the treatment system. 4 to 5 attempts at change before they finally manage to achieve some kind of abstinence or whatever their objective is. We then think of the next critical window as being from the point of abstinence to around 5 years. So we know that there's good actuarial data that basically says, typically from the mid-30s to around the age of 40, there's a window of opportunity where people can move up towards 5 years of continual sobriety. Why is that important? Because in the first year after somebody becomes abstinent, the likelihood of them relapsing is between 50% and 77%. 5 years after, if they maintain sobriety for 5 years, that likelihood drops to 15%. I should have said at the start, not only do I not speak Maori, I don't speak English very well. And I don't even do regional accents very well, because my accent is a combination of my mother's Glaswegian accent and my father's Belfast accent. So you get little bits of Northern Ireland, and you get little bits of Scotland, and it just ends up in a bit of an unholy mess. So if anyone doesn't understand me, tough. Okay, anyway, back to what I was saying. So, 5 years into an abstinent journey, the chance of somebody relapsing is about 15%. And that makes the likelihood of addiction problems not that far away from the general population. It plateaus at that point. People's likelihood of relapse doesn't go any lower than that. So, from a statistical or actuarial perspective, the key part of recovery, and one of the huge messages for policymakers and practitioners is, getting somebody to the point of abstinence is the start of the journey, not the end of the journey. And in all the countries I've ever worked, Scotland, England, Wales, Australia, America, the same problem arises. We are so convinced about the biological chronic relapsing disease models, we fail to consider the post-acute phase, and we don't spend anywhere near enough money, and this means we don't spend enough money on peer-based interventions, on community-based interventions, or on social interventions. We pretend there's some kind of clinical bubble solutions exist in. And the kindest thing you can say is, for some people, specialist addiction treatment is a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient for anyone, and it's not necessary for everyone. These models, the last 2 slides, this developmental pathway model and this notion of time windows, are called ontogenic theories. In other words, they're to do with life course changes. The likelihood of things happening is a developmental sequence or process. If we want to understand recovery in kind of conceptual or theoretical terms, there's an ontogenic life development process that we have to combine with what's called a sociogenic model. Because one of the things we increasingly understand about recovery is it happens not within people, it happens between people. Recovery is not like a virus or an abscess. It's not something that pertains to a body. It occurs in a social space. It's an interpersonal phenomenon. Thus, the solutions are fundamentally interpersonal, every bit as much as they're intrapersonal. They're within people, but they are crucially between people. And for all of this next couple of days, I will argue that that's intrinsic to a recovery model. And in my work, I guess I've probably collected something like 16 or 1700 recovery stories in the last 10 years. And I wish I could tell you a whole series of rules about what makes people recover. But there aren't any, because it's an individualised, personalised process. The only rule, the one rule is, not one of those people has done it alone. It is not something you can do, in spite of numerous people's theories about I'm going to lock myself away in a flat with 200 tins of soup and 400 DVDs. It doesn't work. They will end up with insanity as well as addiction problems. So, we have this model. where we know that the average length of an addiction career is 27 years, the last 5 of which are critical because they are the window of opportunity where we go from people being stigmatised, excluded and pathologised to becoming transformed and changed and better than well. And more of that in a second. Right. There are 3 key evidence foundations about what we know works in recovery. So, about 5 or 6 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, when I worked at Turning Point in Melbourne, we were faced with this challenge of saying, there's a lot of enthusiasm about recovery, but we're not convinced by your evidence. So, Drug and Alcohol Review asked me to commission an article about what we knew, and I got a guy called Keith Humphreys from Stanford University in the States to basically summarise the evidence. What do we know there's overwhelming evidence about in the recovery space? And there are 3 things. Recovery housing. People who go to recovery housing do better than people who don't. This is part of this continuous journey and the notion that housing is a fundamental starting point. You can't start a recovery journey if you don't have a safe place to live that's free from threat. 2, mutual aid. Whatever your personal views and preferences are about 12-step, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, Smart Recovery, there is an overwhelming evidence base that people who go to mutual aid groups do better than people who don't, in terms of both their substance use and their mental health outcomes. The more they go, the better they do, so there's a dose effect. The more actively they participate in meetings, the better they do. And crucially, from the point of view of professionals, there is an additive effect of mutual aid plus treatment. People who go to specialist treatment and to mutual aid do better than people who go to specialist treatment only or mutual aid only. In other words, there is no incompatibility of philosophy in terms of personal outcomes. You go to both, you do better than people who go to one or the other. And the third component of this is peer-delivered interventions are highly effective. And in the few studies that have compared them, peer-delivered interventions typically come out better than professional-delivered interventions on the same intervention. So, from a recovery model, and with that 5-year post-acute treatment, what do you need to do? Well, the 3 things that are fundamental tenets is have housing pathways to get people decent places to live. And tomorrow morning, I will tell you about a project I'm involved in that gets people in recovery to build their own recovery housing. Second, get people to go to mutual aid groups. Which mutual aid groups will depend on their own beliefs and philosophies and views, but mutual aid helps. Third, get them involved in peer-based activities, because that takes you to one of the fundamental premises of the recovery movement, which is recovery does not happen in a clinic, it happens in a lived community, among peers, among families, and among communities. It's a socially community-located activity, not a magic dust dispensed by professionals. Okay. And I'm a professor of criminology, so I have to say something about criminology. So, Fergus McNeill, who's one of my very eminent criminology colleagues from the University of Glasgow, has argued very much the model I'm going to argue for addiction in terms of how people stop offending. And he argues with the same problems in desistance, which is what the posh word is for stopping committing crimes. So, what happens? People stop committing crimes. You think that's it. It's not difficult. Do you stop or don't you stop? Well, that's called primary desistance. The second part of desistance is where you stop committing crimes and other people believe you have stopped, and your own family and friends and all those networks starts treating you like a non-criminal. So your own world stops being a world where you're treated as stigmatised and everybody locks up their purses and wallets and puts away their iPads when you turn up. That's secondary desistance. But tertiary desistance, which is the fundamental point of this talk today, is where society allows you back in. So, You're not told you can't get a job because you've got a criminal record. You can't live in nice housing because we don't want your kind round about here. You can't get on certain college courses. That's tertiary desistance. Now, why does that matter? Because the translation of this to recovery is, for recovery to happen, it requires 3 stages. It requires you to stop using your substance of preference or abuse. It requires your immediate social circles and family to come up with a world where you are no longer seen in that way. And it requires society to come up with a way that you are reintegrated. And the premise for me would be, we can judge the quality of a community on how well it treats, integrates and restores its most stigmatised and excluded members. And that is where the issue of social justice and social contracts arise. Because it is not just down to the person trying harder. It is not just down to them convincing their family and friends that they're in recovery. It is down to everybody in this room to be the champions of reintegration. And in criminology we talk about, we can divide societies into 2 groups. One is called disintegrative shaming. You send people off to prison, you lock the doors, and you really don't want to let them out. And if you let them out, you only let them stay in certain kind of hostels with tags on, and you breathalyse them, and you do all that stuff every day. That disintegratively shames them, because ultimately they'll go back to crime because there's no doors out. Reintegrative shaming societies are societies which say, we will not necessarily punish you less, but when you have done your punishment, we find mechanisms to reintegrate you and for that not to be a part of your world and your past. And precisely the same is true of recovery. Recovery fundamentally is a marker of how good this town, this country are at doing recovery is. How good are the pathways people who have completed their treatment process, their recovery journeys? How good are we at engaging and re-embracing them? How much do we engage in NIMBYism and exclusion? And I'll say a little bit more about that later. And it's fundamentally based on, at the micro level and at the macro level, the premise that Johann Hari has espoused in Chasing the Scream. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is human connection. And that the ultimate pathway to recovery is connectedness. And the ultimate role of every drug and alcohol worker is to create that spark of connection. And in the mental health movement, there's an acronym called CHIME, C-H-I-M-E. Every successful mental health recovery project has 5 characteristics. It creates connectedness, it creates hope, it gives people a positive sense of identity, it gives people a sense of meaning and purpose, and it empowers people. And if you want to know whether any addiction recovery project is a good project, you want to test whether it does those 5 things. And if you want to know whether any drug and alcohol worker, whether they work in a methadone clinic, a detox, a rehab, or a community recovery project is good at their job, the questions you have to ask is, do they connect people? Do they inspire hope? Do they offer people a positive identity that's not about stigmatisation and exclusion? Do they give people a sense of meaning and purpose in their day-to-day lives? And does it empower people to make choices and take control of their own lives? Those are the fundamental premises. This is a painting called Saturn Devouring His Son by Francisco Goya. The 2 biggest recovery studies I have ever done are the Glasgow and Birmingham recovery studies. The Glasgow and Birmingham recovery studies, what we found, we tried to predict what made people do well in recovery, what made people have a high quality of life in recovery. And we took groups of heroin addicts in recovery and alcoholics in recovery. And we did a whole massive series of kind of assessments of functioning. And 2 things predicted how people did in the recovery journey. One, how much time they spent with other people in recovery. The more time with other people in recovery, the better they did. And two, how much stuff they did. The more stuff you did, and it didn't really matter what it was, we just took a sum of positive hours of meaningful activity. Parenting, community group involvement, volunteering, educational training and employment. The more of that you did, the more time you spent with other people in recovery, the better your well-being. So, why Gaia? Gaia is an acronym that is a complex scientific term. Gaia stands for get off your arse. The more you do, the better you do. And we get challenged in this, because we get challenged subsequently on the grounds of, are you sure it's not the other way around? Are you sure it's not the case that the better people are doing, the more they're able to do? So we then had to go back and do this really hideous time series study involving mapping people's changes over time. And it is quite clearly causal. If you start doing meaningful things, your physical well-being, your psychological well-being, and your quality of life all go up. If you stop doing meaningful things, they all go down. Activity pump primes well-being. And in a turning point in Australia, we have a study called Antigenic just now. And we've found exactly the same thing. Because what we've been looking at is people in the 6 months after detox. And what you find is, because it's related to the dopamine hypothesis, that people in the post-acute period find it really hard to experience pleasure from everyday things. So we had one participant in the study who went to watch his son take part in a school race, and his son won the race, and all the other fathers were kind of saying to him, you must be so proud. And he was ashamed of himself, because he was standing there thinking, I don't really give a shit. And he thought there was something seriously pathologically wrong with him. But there was nothing pathologically wrong with him. He was simply anhedonic. The re-regulation of dopamine in the post-acute period is estimated to take about 6 months. But one of the things we think about this is that activity like work, doing stuff regularly, re-regulates dopamine faster. The more meaningful stuff you do, the faster the re-regulation. So the more rapidly people are likely to experience pleasure from food, from walks, from sex, from all of those day-to-day things that should be the sources of pleasure for people. Anyway, moving on. Yeah, the other thing that from my point of view is important is that if you want to understand recovery, it is not a zero-sum game. What do I mean by that? Well, I've done 2 lots of studies with people in long-term recovery who are doing really well. And what we found out is if you use the World Health Organization quality of life scores, what you find is that people in long-term recovery don't have the same quality of life scores as people who've never been addicted at all, which is the population norm scores in the middle. They have better quality of life than people who've never been addicted. In other words, this is where the better than well phrase comes up. Long-term recovery is not about people going back to where they were to start with. It is about growth, development. It's not about the alleviation of symptoms. And this is critically important. I'll say this right at the end, where I've got some good evidence about this. Having people in long-term recovery in your community is better for the community than people who've never been addicted at all, because they are stronger community connectors than the non-addicted populations. So, what am I trying to say here? The purpose of recovery is not to get people back to where they started, because as many people will tell you, the reason I got addicted was because of where I started. It's to get them to a different growth place. The second point is, it gets them to a point where they're a positive strength in the community, not merely back to some kind of meaningless normal. The reason why you want to support recovery, in part, is selfish, because the more people in long-term recovery there are, the better your communities will function. And this is a crucial lesson that is empirically based. But the powerful point about how we get people there is all about connectedness. Oh, right, I'm going too fast. Okay, this is a rare randomised control trial that happened around recovery. In this study, Martlett in the States got 192 people coming out of alcohol detox and randomly assigned them to 2 conditions. One condition was standard aftercare. And sadly in America, as in Australia, as in Scotland, as in England, standard aftercare means nothing. The other group got what's called network support. And network support is, could you add one clean and sober person to somebody's social network? And if you manage to add one clean and sober person to somebody's social network, you reduce the likelihood of them relapsing in the next year by 27%. That is a huge effect. And sadly, and no disrespect to any therapists in the room, no blah 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 therapy will come close to an effect size as good as that. That is not to say they don't have a role to play before anyone shouts at me at lunchtime, but I have done this as well, so there is. If you see somebody once a fortnight for 45 minutes, it's optimistic to think you're sprinkling magic dust on them that'll protect them for the next 2 weeks. Somewhat better to think, have we got some punter that's going to take them fishing, or take them to the football, or take them to mutual aid groups, or meaningful positive things that gives them a genuine sense of life connection. I know where I'd be kind of putting my bets in that situation. That wasn't a gambling reference, which I take back instantly. Now, to go back to the mutual aid movement, what this slide shows is, this is basically the 2 outer egg shapes are basically saying what I've already said. If you go to mutual aid groups, regardless of which ones, you will reduce your substance use. This slide isn't about that. This slide is about what the mechanisms are for effectiveness. And so Keith Humphreys did this structure equation model where it basically said, why do mutual aid groups work? And the conclusion they came to was fourfold. That people who go to mutual aid groups end up with better active coping skills. But they also end up with stronger motivation to change, 2 personal things. But they are driven by social things. They are driven by 2 social things. One is their general social network quality gets better. So their support systems are stronger. And secondly, the motivation of their friends to support their abstinence also goes up. This is far too complicated, so I'm not going to talk about it. If I get time, I might talk about it tomorrow. Actually, I will talk about it. Sorry if nobody gets their lunch today. My apologies. So, this is a study that a colleague of mine from Queensland, Genevieve Dingle, did, where she was looking at non-responsive depressives. And she got them to sing in a choir. And the purpose of getting them to sing in a choir was firstly to build up personal resource. But by building up that personal resource, she was surprised to find they built up social and community resources. And the reason I'm showing this model is, we utilised this in a study in the UK where we got people to play football, and we got them to play football in a team, and we found exactly the same effect. If you get people to do things that are positive, enjoyable, and that have some meaning for them, what it does is, the first thing it does is it improves its self-regulatory function. In other words, it reduces impulsivity, it improves the emotion regulation, but it does it through social informal rules and norms and connectedness. People become involved in these things because of the group, because of the collective. But because they become involved in them because of the collective, so this is the collective, and what it then does is it leads to a second level of collective, which is over here, which is through the groups you belong to, you get access to new groups. So in our world, in our study, what happened with the football project, which was called Sporting Chance, was we got a group of young excluded men to play soccer. And what happened when they started becoming part of the team? When they became part of the team was, I don't know what I'm doing. Somebody else needs to take over this. It improved their emotion regulation and self-regulation through social contact, but through changing their social networks, they had access to opportunity and community opportunity. And this is critical, because their original social networks consisted of other young heroin and crack using males from the same socially excluded backgrounds who had no access to any community resources. Through playing in the teams, they started accessing new community groups. So they extended their social networks to pro-social positive groups, but who did have access to things like information about jobs, houses, courses. So it created social capital and extended the opportunities available to people. How long have I got left?
As long as you need.
Oh, brilliant, right. Okay, get your tents out and your sleeping bags out. We're here for a while. So, the next thing I'm going to talk about is stigma. In 2013, there was an American study conducted by Phillips and Shaw, where they asked people about social distance measures. And what that meant was they asked people, how willing would you be to have the following person date your sister, look after your children, work next to you, move into the house next door to you? And they measured it for obese people, smokers, active addicts, and addicts in recovery. And what they concluded was that people who were both active addicts and people in recovery were more stigmatized than the other two groups. So much so obvious, maybe. Well, what struck me as somebody who's done a lot of stuff in recovery was, isn't it really interesting about social reintegration if people in recovery are kept at the same arm's length as active addicts? Because this doesn't help with that social contract about reintegration. And Lindsay Phillips and our colleague concluded, individuals who are actively using substances and even individuals in remission from substance use are still targets of significant stigma and social distancing. So I wrote to her and said, I really liked your study, but it's rubbish. Can I change it entirely? And so we repeated this study. And what we did was, we got apprentice professionals. We got people who were criminal justice, like probation officer, police officer, prison officer, apprentices, and allied health professionals like paramedics and nurses and psychiatric nurses. And we gave them the questionnaire, except we split it into the groups we assessed were heroin addicts, alcoholics, violent Friday night drinkers, and child sex offenders. And we wanted to know what the level of stigmatisation and exclusion for these groups were, both when they were active in the behaviour and when they were in recovery. The first finding for us, so the maximum score you could get was 32. Somebody you didn't want to live in the same town as, in any domain. You didn't want them looking after your children, you didn't want to work beside them, you didn't want them as neighbours, none of that stuff. So if you're a child sex offender, you score 31 out of 32 when you're an active child sex offender. It's interesting that when you're described as a child sex offender who has completely desisted and stopped that behaviour, the world doesn't believe that people stop child sex offending. Now, whatever you think about this, what that means is the very small gap between these two things means that child sex offenders cannot reintegrate back into society. Because nobody really believes in the rehabilitation of a child sex offender. And this also gives lie to the myth that substance use is the most stigmatised possible condition, because child sex offenders are significantly more stigmatised. Nobody wants anything to do with them under any circumstance. Perhaps not surprisingly, people don't tick the box that says, would you like them looking after your children? But they also wouldn't like a reformed sex offender to work with them, to live near them, to date your sister, to do any of those kind of things. What's interesting from my point of view is the gap between the active condition and the recovery condition is how much people who are going to be professionals believe in recovery. And the answer is not much. In other words, in a group of 300 supposedly idealistic, optimistic students, they really don't believe recovery happens. And one of the challenges for everybody in this room is to think, firstly, How would you answer those questions about willingness for people in alcohol or heroin recovery to date your sister or live in the same street as you or work beside you or look after your kids? And if the answer to those questions is no, it's not, maybe you need to think about a career review. The second thing is, you also should be carrying that message to every other professional. Because stigma isn't about bleating about what's said in the public media. Stigma is about convincing the probation officer, the housing officer, and all of these people that recovery is real. And so changing this, making these gaps bigger, is fundamental to the process of making your community recovery oriented or a therapeutic landscape for change. And we can measure this. The biggest thing from my point of view has been this notion this is all kinds of vague, nebulous stuff. So we now know how to measure where people are, and increasingly where communities are in that recovery journey. So the notion of how somebody does, and you'll notice that this is a social definition. Recovery is about access to resources. It's about social capital. It's not about some kind of where you are in withdrawal or craving or any of that kind of stuff. How good people are, and recovery capital is effectively our predictive power of saying, is this person A, going to relapse, and B, going to successfully grow and develop as a person? That's what it means. And it consists of three things, and this is the social contract. Personal recovery capital is the personal resources and skills people have. Resilience, self-esteem, self-efficacy, communication, coping. Those are the personal resources people have. But they are built up through the scaffolding of social capital. In other words, the diversity of groups you belong to and the range of positive supports you have is the foundation for people developing that personal capital. So that's the second box. The second box, which is over here, is social capital, personal capital. But they are both underpinned by collective recovery capital. What collective recovery capital means, that was in case anyone's drifting off to sleep. I'll just occasionally do this. Oh, I've broken this one now, so nobody can hear me anymore. Oh well. Collective recovery capital is the community level resources. So the top left box is your personal change. The top right box is your immediate networks. But the bottom, the safety net part, is professionals, communities, systems, structures, processes that block you or enable you from change. When we first did this, Alexandra Lodi is a recovery researcher in New York, and we combined my Birmingham and Glasgow data with her New York data. When we first did this, we kind of characterised this as access to jobs, houses, specialist treatment, recovery champions and community groups. And I'll probably change that a little bit now. But fundamentally the premise is, this is where society stigmatises and excludes or reintegrates and re-includes people. And this is a fundamentally social process. This is fundamentally about, for all of us, not just people with addiction problems, we know that the more groups you belong to, the better your resilience and capability. What the social cure means is, and we know this from empirical studies of things like stroke and heart disease, is after you have a heart attack or a stroke, if the number of groups you belong to goes down, your recovery is poorer from a heart attack or a stroke. If the number of groups you belong to stays the same or increases, your recovery time and your recovery rate is higher. So for everyone, nothing to do with addiction, connectedness matters. The more groups you belong to, the better you do. Why? Because groups provide access to resources, practical resources, emotional support, but crucially, they provide a way of understanding and making sense of the world. They provide you with a model of understanding and dealing with day-to-day life problems. The extent to which your belonging to a group is salient determines how you will assess and resolve the problems you face, and that's what I mean by accessibility. More of this tomorrow. When people move from stigmatised groups to pro-social recovery groups, what effectively they are doing is fundamentally altering their access to social resource. They are altering the transition from stigmatised and excluded group to pro-social and positive group, creating that sense of positive identity and change. And in our work, we increasingly come to see, or come to understand, that that transition process provides people with the safety net. Now, whether people start by joining 12-step groups or a broader range of groups, it is this transition process and the extent and speed of that movement of the seesaw from one side to the other that effectively is preventative against relapse. Because the more people are bound in to pro-social positive groups, the bigger the price they'll pay for breaking the rules of those groups. Because what does it mean to be a member of a group and to be a central prototypical member of a group? It means you adhere to the norms, values and rules of the group you belong to. And if that group has norms and values around pro-social behaviour, around abstinence and around giving back to others, you are particularly protected because you pay a much heavier price if you fall over. And that's why pro-social recovery and peer groups are so strongly evidenced within the recovery model. And this is, I'm afraid this is the sum of 20 years of working as an academic in the addictions field. The best I can do is come up with a model that's based on an ice cream with sprinkles on the top. So, in my world, and this is what Saturday will be all about, anyone coming to the workshop, the extent of your recovery, the little man at the bottom with your personal skills and resources, will depend on the access you have to social support and the access that social support has to broader community connectedness and values. So for me, what the role of the worker is in promoting a recovery culture is first, the building of those basic skills, self-esteem, self-efficacy, coping. But not to do that through a therapeutic model, but to do it through a connectedness model of linking people in to champions, to mentors, to peer guides. And they, in turn, should be linking people in to positive community assets in your local community. When we did this in Dandenong in Melbourne with people coming out of repeat offenders coming out of the magistrates court, we identified 99 positive pro-social groups we could actively engage people in to transition that social network from stigmatised and excluded to positive and pro-social. And just to give you an example, so this is like the final thing I will talk about. One of the key roles for people, particularly who don't have indigenous positive social resources, is to assertively link people into positive groups. And this is an old study. 20 people were randomly assigned to try and get them to attend a 12-step group. 10 of them were given a leaflet. 10 of them, the worker phoned up the AA office while they were in the office and said, "Speak to that person now." Of those who were given a leaflet, 0 attended. Of those who were given the phone and made to make an appointment there and then, all 10 attended. What is the point of this story? The first point is, leaflets is an appalling abuse of trees. It is completely pointless. Giving people leaflets, you might as well stick them up their bottom. Because on the whole, people who have low self-esteem, low self-efficacy and struggle with resilience won't follow up on it. It may be made into a roach, it may be deposited in a bin. Assertive linkage is Gaia for workers. If you want people to do pro-social things, get off your arse and take them. Don't rely on folk turning up. And we followed this up. When I worked in the Maudsley Hospital in South London for a number of years, and we had an acute admissions ward. So this was a 10-day clean-up and bang-out ward for heroin, crack and alcohol. And almost nobody who came to the ward attended mutual aid groups. So we did a randomised control trial of 152 people, and we randomised them to 3 conditions. We either gave them a leaflet to say, would you please go to a meeting? Same abusive trees process, pointless. Or we got the booking in doctor, whoever did their initial assessment, the medic who did their initial assessment, to recommend they go. Or a peer came and took them to the first meeting and then had a coffee with them afterwards to talk about it. If a peer came and took them to the meeting, they attended more meetings while they were on the ward, they attended more meetings in the 3 months after departure from the ward, and they used less substances in the 3 months after the ward. Now, this seems to me critical. And for me, this is nothing to do with Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous or Cocaine Anonymous. This is about the principle of getting people into positive things. Now, you could replace mutual aid groups in this study with fishing clubs or football teams. This is about engaging with positive resources in your community. And to do that, you have to do two things. One, you have to know what those positive resources are. And secondly, you have to develop connections. And this is where peers play a role that is absolutely invaluable and irreplaceable. And what is more, they play a role that changes the community, not just the individual. Because they break down the stigma barriers and the exclusion barriers. And that integration with community resources is absolutely essential. Why? We did a Life in Recovery survey in the UK last year. And we had about 800 people complete it. And the key box here, apparently these things are called infographics, which media people make now. I don't know what the point of them is. Anyway, that box there, this one here, of people in long-term recovery, 79.4% actively participated in their local community. And I thought, blimey, that's a lot. So I went to look up what it was for the general public in the UK. And the answer was 39%. So people in long-term recovery are more than twice as likely to be active community connectors in their local community as people who've never been addicted at all and never had any substance problems. Thus, I'll return to that point about you are better having addicts in recovery in your community than people who have never had an addiction problem in their lives, because they are stronger. They are stronger community connectors, and they make those communities better places. So the fundamental conclusion and premise from this talk is supporting recovery is selfish, because the better recovery pathways you get, the better your communities become, because they become more connected, and they get closer to fulfilling that social justice value of saying, am I happy that my community can be judged by how well it reintegrates the most excluded, marginalised and complex individuals within it? And it's a process over time, where the more that transition happens, the more professionals change, so the more the community itself changes and starts to understand that one of its core values is its ability to deal with those who temporarily or over longer periods of time are excluded. Enough for now. For those of you who are interested, Part 2 of this exciting adventure will continue at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. For those of you not interested, have a long life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Recovery lives in the community. Assertive peer support helps. So